Good afternoon to my guests, Honorable Premier Alden McLaughlin from the Cayman Islands and Minister of Finance. I really am very grateful and excited that you've agreed to join me on this webinar today. And of course, good afternoon to everyone attending as well. Welcome.
Hi, Marla. Good to see you again.
Likewise, it's been a while.
And thank you too for hosting us today.
Oh, and thank you for joining. I appreciate it tremendously. So, I mean, as Melissa said, I mean, it's no secret that how I feel about the Cayman Islands, and that I, at every opportunity, talk about how impressed I am at the way the economy is run, especially relative to the rest of the Caribbean. Now, whenever I say this anywhere else in the Caribbean, one of the most common reactions I get is that, well, it's not a level playing field because the Cayman Islands gets all of this support from the UK as a British overseas territory. So I think the best way for us to start is for you to, either of you or both of you in turn, however you feel like doing this, just share with me and with everyone on the call what exactly is the nature of the relationship with the UK, and especially with respect to financial support and so on, just so that we have a clear understanding of the level of support that is forthcoming.
Thank you, Marla. The Cayman Islands is a British overseas territory, and we have a very high level of delegated authority and responsibility. So the administration of the country is divided between the Premier and the Cabinet and the Governor. The Cabinet has responsibility for all aspects of the government, except what I call the special responsibilities of the Governor, which relates to defense, internal security, responsibility for the public service, and a certain degree of responsibility for external affairs, because a great deal of responsibility for external affairs are also delegated to myself as Premier and to the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Financial Services, the Minister of Tourism, with respect to all aspects that we deal with, relations with the European Union, and with CARICOM. All of those are delegated to the Premier of various ministers. So we are essentially in control, the elected government, of the administration of the country in most respects. With respect to financial aid, Cayman has not been granted since the 50s. So we don't receive any form of direct financial contribution from the United Kingdom. As all, we do receive technical assistance from the UK in a number of areas at our request. But other than that, we run things ourselves.
Okay. Honorable Finance Minister, is there anything you wanted to add there?
Well, just to reinforce what the Premier said about the country's finances, with the lack of any support financially coming from the United Kingdom government. We've been paddling our own canoe now for many decades, and I would have to say quite successfully in terms of what we've been able to accomplish.
I would agree with you, and thanks for that clarification. Very important clarification. So I want for you now to tell me, over the past, as you said, since the 1950s, you've not been receiving financial support from the UK government. What have been your development strategies that you've employed since then? Could you share some of those highlights with us?
Well, the thing is that the Cayman Islands has very little in terms of natural resources, except the sea, sun, and sand that just about every country in the region actually has. It is very small in physical size. It is not suitable to agriculture on a great scale, and so for much of our existence, since our settlement some 300 years ago,
it was pretty much subsistence living, some basic farming on the land and living off the sea. Up until the early 60s, our principal export was really seamen. Our men went away to sea and sent home remittances. The huge change came about when a number of things happened. We got our own constitution in 1959 in the run-up to independence by Jamaica, because we were a dependency of Jamaica. Truly the lowest form of constitutional status, I think, in the Westminster system of government. We chose not to go with Jamaica, but to become a crown colony in our own right. Having our own constitution gave us, for the first time, the start of some degree of local control over our affairs, and the creation of our first executive council or cabinet, we call it these days. And those early legislative pointers decided that we needed to find some other means of building the country. The population then was only around 8,000 people, and certain events in the region, some of the decisions that were taken in places like the Bahamas under the Lyndon Pindling government, and the move to independence in Jamaica caused a number of investors and businesses to start looking elsewhere. And Cayman provided pretty much a blank canvas, because we had no legislation here, no regulation with respect to what we now call financial services. I don't think that term had even been invented yet. So those early pioneers had an opportunity to come and essentially design a system to suit what they were trying to achieve. And one of the huge advantages was that Cayman had and still has no form of direct taxation. So that was a huge incentive, and that really were some of the early basis for the establishment of the financial services industry. And over the course of time, over the last 50 years, we have really gone from strength to strength. We have been able to, and I think our immigration policies have also played a huge role, our willingness to accept people from all over the world to help us grow and build our industries, the economy, and the country generally. So in my lifetime, the population has gone from 8,000 people to 64,000.
Wow. And so, I mean, you have the tourism sector and the financial services sector as the largest sectors in the Cayman Islands, driving the economy basically. But apart from that, can you point to any other policies and the key pillars of your policy agenda that have driven the success that you experience today? Can you share some of those insights with us?
Well, from the earliest days, the Cayman Islands government, and I'm not talking about my government, I'm talking about the governments
successive governments
of my grandfather and my uncle and those who've gone before, have understood that a partnership with the private sector is absolutely critical to the development of these two key industries, what we now call financial services and tourism. And the private sector has played a huge role in the development of government policy. Governments over the years have been very responsive to the market feedback and those who are in the market in terms of shaping and creating legislation, financial services products to suit what the market was actually demanding. And in many instances, we've actually been market leaders and thought leaders on a whole range of financial services products, which are being copied or replicated, let me use a nice word, by other jurisdictions now.
And Marla, if I might add, all that the Premier has said is really underpinned by one broad principle, and that is in a very stable macroeconomic environment through a very disciplined fiscal policy that we have adopted throughout the last years of our administration, at least, and even success for previous governments. We find that, and I've experienced that, when you have such a disciplined approach, what it does invest with certainty, and that things would be very predictable for them in terms of what is required for them to invest and what they can expect to pay for the privilege or be taxed in terms of making investments locally. So that has really stood us well and withstood the test of time. And so that's the main strategy and commitment, is to maintain that fiscal discipline and responsibility and positive environment for growth.
Right. And I mean, that I'm very passionate about fiscal responsibility. I mean, you have so many countries in the Caribbean who have racked up debt, in excess of the size of the economy, over 100% of GDP. And, I think the premise upon which the governments do this is that they have this misconception that when governments spend in this region, it generates growth. But what in fact happens is that when governments spend, it promotes imports, because there is high fiscal leakage and most of what we consume is imported. And so you've been able to meaningfully, consistently demonstrate that you can have fiscal responsibility, as evidenced by overall fiscal surpluses, alongside consistent and stable growth around 2% for years. And that makes the Cayman Islands an outlier in the Caribbean for sure. So anybody that says otherwise, that no, you need fiscal spending to generate growth, obviously is missing this point and probably using that argument to their own, for political expediency, basically, and their own agenda. So, but the next question, I mean, the Cayman Islands is not without its challenges, right? Everywhere, every entity has challenges. What would you say right now, or even historically, could have or can be done differently or be done better? What would you like to see change in terms of a policy direction for the Cayman Islands?
Well, I think that we are doing things fairly well, the things over which we have control. The great challenges for places like us and even places that are bigger than us is that our economy relies on inward investment, and in terms of the financial services business, international businesses utilizing it. And both of these areas are very, very vulnerable for a number of reasons. We constantly face challenges. We're facing some now from the European Union, the threats of blacklisting, which of course create reputational issues for the jurisdiction and then cause investors to question whether or not they should actually do business in a jurisdiction such as ours. External shocks, obviously the global financial crisis from 2008, which I think finally we are out of now, had a huge impact on us, because we don't generate very much locally in terms of economic activity. The local economic activity some people like to claim that development and construction are one of the smaller pillars of our economy. The truth of the matter are they do contribute, but they are driven by the other two, financial services and tourism, and the demand for properties, essentially, and the development of properties to support those two industries. So when business falls off for one reason or another in financial services or tourism, we do really suffer. So some of the things that we've been trying to do since we took office, and even the government before us, is to find ways to make our economy a bit more resilient. And I think one area in particular that I think has huge potential and is developing very quickly is tertiary healthcare provision. With the advent of what we call Cayman Islands Health City, which is led by Dr. Devi Shetty, the Indian heart surgeon of huge international repute, is doing very, very well for us, because this might sound a bit blunt or harsh or even heartless, but the truth of the matter is people get ill in good times and in bad. So health tourism is a much more reliable area of the industry than leisure tourism, because it's only when people have money and time that they do the leisure tourism bit. So we have as a government allowed significant concessions and incentives to attract and retain what Cayman Islands Health City is doing, and its reputation across the region and more broadly into the U.S. is growing by leaps and bounds. They have now gone from just the basic hospital that they had to having completed now assisted and apartments for their staff, and they are moving now to the development of a specialized cancer center. And so the prospects for that, I think, are huge, and will bring and continue to bring huge benefit, not just to Cayman, but the wider Caribbean, many countries of which are already utilizing these services because they are available. These top-level tertiary healthcare services are available at a fraction of the cost that you would pay in the United States.
Oh, okay. Well, and I mean, I commend you for this initiative, because it really requires leadership and political will to identify a strategy that will work and that is, I suppose, relevant to your conditions, and be able to execute on it as well as you have. One of the things that always strikes me in the Cayman Islands is the fact that, as you said, you have more than 60,000 people resident in the Cayman Islands. I think it's over 120 or so nationalities present there. Yet still, I've observed this, peace and harmony and coexistence that really, when you think about it, again, Cayman Islands is an outlier in the region, because I don't know of anywhere else in the region where you have that level of diversity. I might just suggest to you, therefore, like I have suggested in Trinidad, that we should bottle and sell happiness, not literally, but of course, we seem to be happy regardless. I think the Cayman Islands, you seem to be peaceful and harmonious despite the level of diversity and the amount of I suppose, different cultural tensions that might exist in other countries if it was not so harmonious. Perhaps the Cayman Islands can brand itself as not just the place you come for, medical tourism, but the place you come to experience this unique situation where you have so many diverse cultures and people all in one very tiny, small space. You're almost like a microcosm for the whole world when you think of it that way. What are your thoughts on that? How do you feel about perhaps branding the Cayman Islands as a microcosm for the whole world, and a place where you can, per square meter, you can measure how much diversity exists in the Cayman Islands and how peaceful it still is despite all of that?
Well, Marla, what you just said is something that I brag about all the time. Mm-hmm. I always say to people that we are the United Nations of the Caribbean.
Of the world.
But I don't know if I can go that far, but certainly there is. I mean, I've been the length and breadth of the Caribbean, and I don't know anywhere that quite comes close to the way Cayman is in terms of its population. To find 120 different nationalities in a population of 64,000 people is quite incredible. And I'm going off the subject just a little, but we are now claiming to be the culinary capital of the Caribbean, because there is such a diversity and so many very good restaurants that offer a huge range of ethnic food. And it is, again, becoming one of the things that separates us, makes us unique and more attractive to visitors. But I mean, all is not sweetness and light, believe you me, because when you have the level of immigration that we have had over the course of the last 40, 45 years, it does bring with it certain levels of tensions. There's always a challenge, always, as long as I can remember, between ensuring that local people have the opportunities, economic and employment opportunities that they should have in an economy that is as successful as ours is, while balancing the demand and taking into account the need to continue to import the skills that we need to continue to build Cayman's economy. So there's always a tension there.
Yeah.
Sometimes, and quite often, you hear Caymanians on talk shows and so forth, speaking somewhat resentfully about this foreigner taking their job, or that they didn't get this promotion, they gave it to a foreigner. So I don't want to come away from this, or anyone to come away from this this webinar believing that all is sweetness and light, and we don't have, that we're a special breed of people who just behave like angels. But and welcome everybody home. But we have, what we managed to do over generations now, it is to manage those tensions in a way that they don't spill over, where there is not the kind of hatred of foreigners that I have personally experienced in some other places. And most Caymanians recognize, even if they don't like the idea of all these foreigners here, that the presence of so many people from elsewhere is a major factor in the lifestyle that Cayman enjoys.
Indeed. And I mean, the fact that you have people coming from all over the world, 120 countries, to the Cayman Islands, basically, and coming there to work, whether in the tourism and hospitality sector or in the financial services sector, these people come with all of their views and expectations of what life should be like. Also, I would gather, and I mean, I would share my own view that, and this is something that I've had webinars with other people to discuss about the cultural implications on your economy. And my sense of the culture of the Cayman Islands and the nature of the people and the mindset of the people that come to the Cayman Islands, they come there to work and they come with progressive ideas and a way of thinking. And I think that is also not just the diversity itself, but that kind of mindset, I think, is part of the reason why the Cayman Islands is as successful as it is. And this is just my very unscientific view on that. But, just as we conclude, before we go to the questions, I just, both of you, I want to ask you to just share with us and conclude by telling us, if you had the opportunity to address an audience of all of the Caribbean policymakers, what would you say to them as to the most important factors that they have to achieve to ensure sustainable growth and development in a small and resource-poor country? What would you say to them?
Well, I think the first point that I would make, which I've already made in this webinar, is that you've got to be open to the rest of the world. Insularity is a killer of growth. You've got to be willing to embrace people from elsewhere, and ideas and concepts from elsewhere, and make them your own. Yeah. I think that is a key factor. Political stability is also very, very critical. A country that operates on the basis of the rule of law, with an absence or at least very, very low levels of corruption, which are regarded as not acceptable, is critical to business and investors. And fiscal discipline fiscal system and fiscal responsibility are absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
Low levels of debt and surplus budgets create a level of confidence and credibility, and allow you a whole lot of opportunity to do things which, absent that, you might find very, very difficult to do. And the final factor, but probably one of the most important, is you have to ensure that your own people feel that they are able to share in the tremendous economic success that you are, that your policies are engendering. Because if your people feel that it's only the foreigners who are being able to benefit from all of these things, then, as we say in this part of the world, dog eat the supper.
Yeah. So that growth has to be broad-based and inclusive. Agreed. Honorable Minister of Finance.
Well, to that, I would add that one of the things that really that help to generate and that should be encouraged is good governance and the rule of law. And again, that adds to the certainty, the transparency of your government. Again, instilling the confidence and in the people and investors, and giving them the certainty that they need in order to make those kinds of decisions that need to be made for the benefit of your country. A stable economic environment too is also very important.
Yes, stability, right. So I think we're in a position now where we can take some questions. Melissa?
Yes, just now got a question as the Premier was speaking about debt, the low debt, and it's that given that the debt is low and that government collects more revenue than it spends, why not reduce some of the taxes or fees imposed in the Cayman Islands?
Well, we actually have done that, and we did that before we were actually in this position, because the country did go through a difficult patch, as did just about every other country in the world during the global recession. But when we came into office, we have no form of direct taxation, so it's principally consumer-based taxation that we have. One of the challenges when you have this system of taxation is it's very difficult to do things to lower the cost of living. And of course, everybody's always complaining about the cost of living anywhere you go, particularly in Cayman. But government's levers in that regard in our system are quite limited. Anything the government does, if we increase import duty on anything, you can believe that the costs of the products are going to go up. But if we reduce it, we can't ensure that it's necessarily going to be reduced. So we reduced import duties from 20% to 22% on the things that are dutiable. There's virtually no duty on food, except the sort of luxury items. But basic foodstuffs, there's no import duty at all. Where we did make a significant difference is the duty that was charged on diesel used for the purpose of generating electricity had been charged at 75 cents a gallon. And one of the first things we did was to reduce that to 25 cents, because that is what we call a flow through and goes in directly to the consumer without any ability of the electricity company to do anything about it. So we've done those things. We reduced fees for the trade and business licenses because a lot of the local businesses were struggling. Many of them hadn't been able to pay their fees over the course of the recession. And so we offered forgiveness and a reduction. If they pay the reduced fee for the current year, we would forgive the previous years. So we took measures like this to give local businesses a chance of getting back in the game and to encourage and spur the incorporation and the development of new businesses. And it has been incredibly successful. Maybe the Minister of Finance will remember the actual numbers. I don't like to quote numbers unless I have them accurate, so I won't try, but it has been incredibly successful. And the growth in the local economy has been remarkable over the course of the last 4 years. So there will always be complaints about the cost of living, But we introduced a policy at the start of the last administration, which was 2013, that we would introduce no new fees or taxes anywhere. And we've held to that promise, not only through the last administration, but so far through the first year of this administration. And none of the indications we have tell us that we should change that course. We have a view and a policy that the lower levels of taxation you have, the more economic activity you're likely to generate. And so while some will feel that if you increase the taxes, the results to government revenue would be more positive, we take the other view, is that the lower the level of taxation, the more economic activity there is, which will increase not only government revenue, but economic and employment opportunities for people. And so far, our policy, our strategy seems to be working.
And in addition to what the Premier mentioned, Marla, I would say we've been using excess cash generated by our surpluses to actually pay down debt very substantially. Yes. We've done that where we have been able to do so. We have been prepaying or repaying debt where there are no penalties imposed in order to accomplish that. So last year alone, we paid down additional $10 million that we didn't have to, and we're also using that excess cash in order to fund a number of the capital projects that we have ongoing. And we've got some very substantial projects that are ongoing and are about to come up that, we believe that with the existing taxes in place that we have now, that we should be able to finance the majority of that without any borrowing whatsoever. So, wow. I mean, by the end of 2019, we will have seen our public debt decline by more than 50% since we have taken office in 2000, from the previous administration, of which we both were a part in 2013. So, I mean, it's that we see too, has other knock-on effects as well in terms of reduction in interest expense and to service the debt. So it's all been very positive in terms of stabilizing and putting us on a very firm footing financially.
Just to give you an example of one of these major projects, we're currently tripling the size of our airport.
Yes, I saw that.
And the soft opening for that will be in September. It'll be complete in December, and we're doing all of that without borrowing a single penny.
Wow.
We are doing some major infrastructure improvements with respect to our road network, and we're doing all of that without borrowing any money. So when you have the kind of revenue that we are able to generate, and when you keep paying down your debt and restrain unnecessary government expenditure, particularly on the recurrent end, you suddenly find that you have a level of fiscal flexibility and freedom, which hitherto you would have thought impossible.
Right. And I like the idea of instead of increasing the tax rate, you lower the tax rate, but you broaden the tax base so that you still end up with more revenue, but you also end up with a larger and more prosperous economy. I don't know that any other country in the Caribbean is looking at that approach. To me, including Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, they're all looking at increasing the tax rate, which of course, as you mentioned, is to the detriment of overall economic activity and therefore also by the tax base as well. And I commend you on all of these capital projects and initiatives that are taking place without borrowing. I mean, coming from the banking sector myself, I know that the lenders must be so disappointed. The development banks as well as the commercial banks must be so disappointed because, the Cayman Islands is the best credit in the region. From a government perspective. So not being able to lend you and have your borrowing in their portfolio must really keep them up at night,
We hear it from all of the commercial banks.
But Marla, there's another point I just wanted to make, which is not directly on point with what you're saying, but the other thing that we look at and I continue to look at very carefully is that now our economy is really really motoring along. And you look at the long list of development projects which are either in the process of being approved by the Central Planning Authority or have been approved, or construction is actually started. And more recently, I've had a significant community person pushing a particular government for a government to engage in a particular project and start spending money. And I said, no, you have to convince me, while I am Premier, you have to convince me that this project is absolutely critical to Cayman's infrastructure in some way. When we have this level of economic activity, particularly in the development and construction area, for government now to go and enter the field and propose another project, which is going to take more construction workers and more resources, and then have to borrow the money to do it, is not only unnecessary, but we start to run the risk of the economy actually overheating. Let's hold strain, and I won't be Premier then, no doubt, but when things start to slow down, as inevitably they will, if government has the resources because it's handled its financial affairs properly, that is the time that the government should enter and help to spur and continue economic activity. So that's the kind of approach we have adopted. We can't and we shouldn't try to build and fix everything in 1 or 2 terms. Government is a continuum and life goes on. So we need to plan these things properly so that government is there and able to step in when things slow down otherwise, not to compete with what the private sector is doing now for resources.
Exactly. And if I may, I'm aware, Finance Minister, you wanted to say anything in this regard? No? That whole, what you just described is classic counter-cyclical fiscal policy. When things have slowed down, that's when the government ought to step in and spend more or borrow to spend and engage in activities that will boost jobs and overall, economic activity. And then when things are good and times are, in times of plenty is when the government should pull back and not overheat or attempt to overheat the economy. And in the Caribbean, we have the reverse taking place. When in times of plenty, we throw a big party, we spend a lot of money, and then when times are leaner, there isn't anything left. And so that counter-cyclical fiscal policy that you've described that has worked for the Cayman Islands and that you are still employing, I congratulate you, and I wish so many other governments in the region would pay attention and would look at you as an example as to just how well this can work, because I think they're not convinced that it works. But let me see if we have any other questions, Melissa.
Yes. What unusual policy experiments, whether successful or unsuccessful, have been tried in the Cayman Islands that you think others in the Caribbean or elsewhere could especially learn from or study in more depth?
Unusual policy experiments. Hi, guys.
We lost you for just a minute, but welcome back. So the question, the question again was looking at unusual policy experiments that you've tried in the Cayman Islands, whether or not they've been successful, that you think others in the Caribbean or elsewhere could benefit from learning from those experiences.
Unusual policy experiments.
Have there not been any unusual policy experiments?
Our policies are well thought through, well reasoned before we implement, and that's why we have been so successful.
But being unusual or being, different is not necessarily a bad thing. I would say, yes, there are other countries where the expatriate population is large. The Bahamas, for example, being one of them. But I would say that that's possibly, if I had to think about just from my knowledge of the Cayman Islands, I would say that that's unusual from a statistical standpoint relative to the rest of the Caribbean. There are not many countries in the Caribbean I mean, even right now in Trinidad, we have a situation where it is estimated over 120,000 illegal immigrants in Trinidad and Tobago. This is what I heard on the news yesterday from the former Minister of National Security. And we have a difficulty addressing and dealing with these illegal immigrants, especially since we have an influx from Venezuela. Perhaps this policy of inviting expatriate labor to fill your skills gap and to service your industries could be considered unusual in the Caribbean. This is just my perspective.
Well, perhaps, but the thing is, as I said, in 1960-61, the population was only 8,000 people. Mm-hmm. When I graduated from high school, the population was still only about 16,000 people. So the numbers are so small. It's a matter of scale. I think the brilliance, if you want to call it that, of the Caymanian government, I'm talking about mine, I mean over the years, was the recognition and acceptance that if we wanted to build this country, we were going to have to open up to immigration. Mm. And while that has had some stresses and some significant stresses and strains and continues to do so, without question, that really is what has driven our development at the incredible pace that it has gone during my lifetime. I mean, sometimes I can't believe it, because I mean, the Cayman that I grew up in, we didn't have a radio station even until 1975. Wow. I remember when some of the districts got electricity, and here we are now. The Cayman that you have visited recently, Marla. It's very difficult to believe that that's the case, where most of the roads were unpaved. Some areas didn't have roads at all. That's the Cayman that I grew up in, and it's changed so incredibly in my lifetime. Most of that has been the result, has been because of the impact of immigration.
Right.
Marla, you also mentioned the issue you have in Trinidad with the illegal immigration, and we don't have that here. And what that does, but as you well know, I mean, when you have that level of illegal immigrants, it just creates an underground or a black or underground market, an underground economy that remains generally untaxed and continue to be a burden on your country. And that sort of thing that we would strive at all times to not to allow to happen here.
Yeah, and the thing about the difference in the strategy that you've employed versus what I wouldn't even say it's a strategy, it's a de facto position I can speak for Trinidad, is that we didn't have a strategy, so what we end up with is what ends up happening when you don't have proper border control. You don't have a proper immigration policy that allows, we have a skills gap here in Trinidad too, and we have a labor force that isn't willing to work in certain jobs. And therefore, we should have had an immigration strategy that seeks to address those issues, but we didn't. And so what we end up with is illegal immigrants. And so the best way in any situation is to have a strategy and be proactive than to be reactive, which is what we're dealing with now in Trinidad. Melissa, do we have any other questions?
Yes, I've had a few people write regarding the other side of the fiscal surplus equation, which is spending, and just questioning the level of social services offered in Cayman as far as healthcare, education goes. And if you could just comment on what is the level of free services, social services that are offered in Cayman Islands. And they're just questioning whether or not it's at the same level that you would get in Barbados, in Trinidad, or in other countries throughout the region.
I think the answer to that is probably that it is significantly lower. Education is free all the way to high school for completion of high school for Caymanians, and scholarships are widely available, not just to the local university college, but more broadly. But that is based on obviously your acceptance to recognized universities or institutions of higher learning. On healthcare, there is no free healthcare, at least not officially, although government has an unofficial policy that has existed for many years, is that if there is a Caymanian who is unable to pay for their healthcare, particularly tertiary healthcare, most of which is provided until recent times in the United States, government generally picks up the tab, although the families will seek to underwrite it, but very rarely does government get paid back if the amounts involved are truly significant. We do have we do require there's a mandatory requirement for every person who is working must have health insurance, but the level of coverage that is required is fairly basic. So that is an area of great challenge to us, which we are this government is seeking to address. Without question, what we have is inadequate in that regard. In terms of direct sort of social service assistance, we do provide that at a fairly basic level to persons who are struggling, even if only temporarily, to put bread on, to put food on the table and keep the lights on. And we do provide what we call permanent financial assistance to the indigent, particularly the old and infirm, but again at relatively low levels.
Mm-hmm. I guess that would also be a function of the fact of that you have, basically not many taxes, no direct taxes, at least in the Cayman Islands, therefore not in a financial position to provide these services. So this is the trade-off. I guess that's what that caller question was directed to. Melissa, do we have time for any more questions? And do we have?
I have one last question, and then I think that we've come to the end of the session. So the last question that I have is related to equality, and the question, the caller questions the legislation and the support for equality in the Cayman Islands regarding issues such as gender equality, gay rights, mental health, and is just concerned whether you have a first world economy that is going to develop or potentially has developed profound inequality issues. So if you could just comment on that, what's being done to achieve a more rounded conversation in terms of equality.
Right. The issues you've identified are issues that we have found challenging. We're making huge headway, my administration, on the mental health issues and the provision of adequate mental health medical care, and we are pressing now, just about to begin construction on a residential mental health facility in the Cayman Islands, because hitherto we've had to send many of those sorts of patients overseas for care. So that's an area that I'd have to admit has been neglected for quite some time. In terms of gender equality, I think we are in pretty good shape. The issue, we've got gender equality legislation, and I think huge strides are being made across the board in terms of remuneration, equal remuneration for equal work between the genders. One of the areas that we continue to lag behind on are the number of women who are represented in the Legislative Assembly. There's generally no shortage of women contesting the elections, but getting them elected is much more difficult. And so there's a gender imbalance in the Legislative Assembly, an area that is much more difficult to address, and I'm sure you can fix that by legislation. But where we're having real challenges really is on the LGBTQ and whatever other they've added to it now issue. And we are currently going through challenges with respect to whether or not we should recognize or permit civil unions and
Have we lost them?
I apologize. I did not realize I myself was on mute. They, yes, we have the same connectivity issue that we had a little bit earlier.
I mean, it was an important point. It's such a pity, though. It's an important point to make because, I mean, as successful as the Cayman Islands is, if you don't have inclusiveness and equality, that can start to erode, you know, your social stability.
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, let's wrap it up there. I just want to thank everybody who was on the call for staying through, especially the technical difficulties. And we look forward to having future webinars and with important discussions like this. Thank you very much for participating.